Good afternoon. My name is Stapleton Roy. I'm the director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for our program, which features the new book by Stephen Roach, who's seated on my left, my right from your perspective, called The Next Asia, Opportunities and Challenges for a New Globalization. I think all of us recognize that the global financial crisis is what we would call a game-changing event in world affairs, one that could, in terms of its longer-term consequences, be as significant or even more significant than the collapse of the Soviet Union nearly 2 decades ago. We don't know what the full consequences will be of the crisis because, to a significant degree, we're still in the midst of it. To quote from Stephen's book, an unbalanced and interconnected world is now in the midst of a painful but necessary rebalancing. And that's still going on. What makes the crisis particularly significant is that it integrated 3 separate but connected trends in the world. The first was the rise of Asia, the second was the spread of globalization, and the third was the growing and largely unrecognized by many distortions in the U.S. economy. One of the surprising things about the crisis is how many really knowledgeable people failed to anticipate it and failed to see the warning signs. But there were exceptions. And the author of this new book, Mr. Roach, is one of them. He has been writing articles for years.
Some would say longer.
Pointing out the problems that have now come to a head and been important contributing factors to the global financial crisis that we're now experiencing. So I think we're fortunate to have him here today to make some remarks about his new book, and we have some informed commentators to also add their perspectives on the book and on the ideas that Mr. Roach is setting forth. We will have a chance then for interaction with all of you. There will be time for questions and answers. I'm looking forward to this because I expect to learn as much from this session as I did from reading the book, which I commend to all of you. It really addresses issues that are at the heart of what's going on now, and with a particular appreciation of the Asian factors that are so tied up with the current global crisis. Stephen, could I turn the microphone over to you?
Thank you very much, Stape, and thanks to all of you for coming, and a real thanks to the Kissinger Institute for sponsoring this event. It's been a particular, actually a particular pleasure for me to discuss many of the themes that are developed in the book with Dr. Henry Kissinger over the years, who, of course, stands alone in his insights into many dimensions of the Chinese experience and its relationship to the United States and the broader global economy. And thanks also to my good friends Nick, Stanley, and Bert for taking some time out of their day to engage all of us in a discussion. This is, I think, a really terrific time to have a new book out on Asia, because in a growth-starved, post-crisis world, there's a desperation to find a new answer, an answer that can keep the world humming just as it has been or had been in the 5 or 6 years before this crisis began to unfold about 2 years ago. huge appetite for growth. Growth is viewed as the answer to all problems that hit the world and the antidote to unexpected developments. And so there's a tremendous interest in Asia as the new engine of global economic growth, recognizing that the old engines are going to be running at a much slower speed for quite some time. Now, I have to say, as somebody, Stape was right, I'd been warning about this crisis in certainly the United States and its global implications for a number of years. And it usually happens in things like this. You know, in the end, when the boy keeps crying wolf, you know, people just forget about you and just merrily go on their ways. And I was either stubborn enough or dumb enough to just stay with this view, and it got so tedious for my colleagues on Wall Street to hear me that they came up with this great idea to deport me and ship me out to Asia. They knew that I was pretty optimistic on Asia, so they said, "Well, let's get him somewhere where he's, you know, more upbeat and happy, and we don't really have to deal with these concerns that he has back home." And so I did go out to Asia full time a little over 2.5 years ago, and within hours of my arrival, I turned negative on Asia. That's really not true. But it did become evident to me that there were a lot of assumptions being made out in Asia and around the world about Asia that I was having a hard time grasping, understanding, and agreeing with. And one of them is this notion that Asia has arrived as an autonomous engine of economic activity that could decouple itself from the rest of the world in the event of a problem anywhere else in the world. And honestly, I never got that because to me, Asia has been and still is dominated by exports and depends critically on the external demand underpinnings of the export machine. And so how in the world can an externally dependent region just miraculously decouple? And yet that was the view going into the crisis. Then there was this crisis, and there was certainly no decoupling during the crisis. The developed world went into a rare synchronous recession, and every single economy in Asia slowed sharply or went into their own recessions. Hardly evidence of decoupling. And so the decouplers went into a cave for 6 or 9 months, but now they're back because the Asian markets have surged back. All the markets are up a lot since March, but emerging markets are up more. The developing Asian markets are up the most. And it's decoupling 2.0. So it's very relevant, I think, to weigh in on the Asia story post-crisis and in this market environment and in a context where leaders around the world are very focused, and understandably so and correctly so in my view, on global issues, how we all fit together, how economies in one part of the region affect economies in other parts of the region, dealing with these imbalances that have clearly become a serious matter for the stability in this post-crisis world. So that's sort of the backdrop. I just want to comment on a few of the themes in the book, and then I'm really looking forward to hearing the input from our illustrious panel. When I speak about Asia in the book and this afternoon, I speak in my own mind of a very China-centric region. I think one of the most striking developments in the region since the crisis of the regional crisis of 97-98 is the growing China-centric character of almost the entire region. And I think India would be an important exception, but the region is very, very integrated into a increasingly China-centric supply chain. So I will sort of jump back and forth in referring to either Asia or China, but you could easily use those words interchangeably in what I'm about to tell you. Today's Asia, I think, is probably the most unbalanced economic region in the world, although it's a tough call between Asia and the United States. But I look at a couple of key trends here. The export share of developing Asia region as a whole at the end of the 1990s was about 35% of pan-regional GDP, and going into the subprime crisis in 2007, that number was about 47%. And meanwhile, the internal private consumption share over that same period fell from the mid-50s to the mid-40s. So, very dynamic region, there is no question about it, but a region whose dynamism was driven much more so by the vigor of the export machine than by the gains of internal private consumption. It doesn't mean that consumption is not growing. It just means in explaining the world's most rapidly growing region, you want to look much more toward exports and the factors driving exports in generating such rapid growth. This crisis, I believe, is a real wake-up call for this externally dependent region, because it's a crisis that ultimately will prove very challenging for external demand conditions that are so important in shaping the appetite for goods made in Asia. And look no further than the United States, the biggest consumer in the world, and it's pretty clear, at least to me, that the days of extraordinarily rapid consumption growth in the United States, gains which averaged close to 4% a year for a dozen years, from the mid-90s through 2007, those days are over, finished, done. The consumption share of U.S. GDP today stands at 71.2%. It's a record for America. It's a record for any major economy in the history of the world. But unfortunately for Americans, it was not supported by income. The income generation in this expansion for America was horribly short of historic norms. What drove consumption to excess were two bubbles, property and credit, both of which have now burst. And so the American consumer, post-crisis, with no income support, no asset bubble support, no credit bubble support, with low saving, record debt, job shocks, unemployment rate shocks, that consumption share of U.S. GDP has to come down. And, you know, I've got some articles in this book that describe the nature of the adjustment. I think it'll take a number of years. I think over that period, the consumption growth, the trend will go from 4 to roughly 2 or 1.5 to 2%. And there's no other consumer in the world that's going to take the American consumer's place. So for export-led economies, Asian in particular, where's the external demand going to come from? And that's the wake-up call for the model that has been so beneficial to China and to other major economies in this region for so long in achieving extraordinary progress on the development and poverty reduction and modernization fronts. It's been the right model, and I give China in particular enormous credit for realizing the benefits that would accrue to its citizens, to its economy, by developing an export machine and plowing surplus savings into the investment underpinnings of the export machine at just the right time and in just the right place. But the question is one of sustainability. And I think this crisis is a real wake-up call in terms of the sustainability of the model that has worked so well for the old Asia. The next Asia is a different model. And this crisis says that this is now the time for the region to begin focusing on a different model. And if it works, it'll be a model where the growth dynamic begins to shift away from external demand support to one that is increasingly supported by internal demand. And it'll be a model that fosters the development of private consumption as opposed to one that rides on the back of excess consumption elsewhere in the world. And it's not a quick transition. It's certainly going to take a lot of time. The structural change, by definition, always takes a lot of time. But there is a certain urgency in this post-crisis climate that I think will require Asia and China in particular to focus on this transition as a clear and immediate challenge. The way I see things playing out in China, which is critical for the rest of Asia, is that right around the middle of next year, the momentum that we see right now in China, as impressive as it is going to fade. Because the Chinese momentum so far this year is predominantly reflective of a government stimulus package that was put in place late last year that's been hugely supportive to investment spending. But the impetus from this investment stimulus will begin to fade around the middle of next year, and the second piece of the stimulus package that China has embraced, incentives to exports that normally work when the global economy turns around, they will not play out because of the weakness in external demand. And so, as was the case late last year when China slowed, and this was a very disconcerting and worrisome development for Beijing, there could be another slowing in the middle of next year. And if you know anything about China, you know that slow growth, rising unemployment, is a huge threat to the most important goal of the Chinese leadership, and that's social stability. And this post-crisis climate is a real wake-up call to China that something must be done now to deal with the social stability implications of what could be a drawn-out weakening in external demand. How do you go from exports to consumption? It's certainly not easy. In the book, I stress one thing, especially insofar as China is concerned, and that's to build a social safety net. China's talked about this for a long time, but it's mainly been talk. It hasn't been action. In the current 5-year plan, the 11th 5-year plan, the broad outlines of a consumer-led society were identified 3.5, 4 years ago. But the consumption share has continued to decline. In a large part, in my view, this reflects a big increase in fear-driven or precautionary saving that is directly tied to the absence of a social safety net. In the 12th five-year plan, which will be enacted, I guess, in early 2011, and the planning for which is now underway, I actually suspect that that Beijing will be much more explicit and forceful in laying out the blueprint for the new consumer society in China. And I think you will see explicit proposals floated in the social safety net area, especially for Social Security, private pensions, medical care, and unemployment insurance. But I think the Chinese will go well beyond the safety net in their pro-consumption plan for the 5 years beginning in 2011. They'll also lay out, I think, a fairly detailed blueprint for the development and expansion of large-scale consumer products and service industries. And I want to just stress the services piece because China has the smallest services sector, 40% of its GDP, of any major economy that I've seen. And this is a huge opportunity for China to really stress a new, untapped form of economic activity. And, you know, a lot of people say it's this is just such a long-term glacial trend that, you know, it's impossible to envision this type of transition occurring in a fashion that can really deal with some of these near-term issues. I don't buy the idea that Asian DNA, especially Chinese DNA, is pre-programmed to saving. Anytime, you know, I confront people who tell me that all the Chinese want to do is save, and they've done it for generations, and I hear them tell me this, you know, when I'm in Hong Kong, I offer to take them on a boat to Macau. But I think, you know, again, if you see the safety net start to get put in place forcefully over this next 5-year plan, you'll be surprised at the speed by which at least the precautionary piece of saving is reduced, and that instills a greater sense of support for consumption. In the end, I think, and I'll sort of finish on this point, the Chinese in particular, but Asians in general, are immensely practical people. They will do what it takes to sustain economic development and to preserve social stability. And their approach in dealing with the external environment, over which they have very little control, is now being challenged by this crisis, and those challenges are likely to endure for years to come. So this practical, pragmatic Asian society has two choices: accept slower growth or change the model. And again, I believe that a pragmatic region will adopt and will change. The benefits for China, for Asia, and the world are enormous if this shift from the old to the next Asia takes place, as I hope and as I envision in this book. You move from exports to consumption. It's a critical piece in the so-called global rebalancing equation. Huge benefit. You move from exports and investment to consumption. You reduce surplus saving. You reduce your current account surplus. And you begin to dampen some of the trade tensions that have emanated from China and tensions that I worry about. And certainly those worries were an important part of this book as well. By focusing more on a consumption growth dynamic and its services underpinning, you change the intensity of Chinese GDP that is dependent on natural resources, industrial materials, oil, that have such negative implications for environmental degradation and pollution. It's a growth model that becomes greener and lighter, and I think more sustainable. And finally, by really focusing on the services piece of the consumer society, you're moving into a much more labor-intensive form of economic activity. The manufacturing model is very capital-intensive and therefore has a hard time absorbing the surplus labor that these large population economies need. And so a services-based model is a very important answer for regions that and economies that are faced with still enormous poverty problems and the need to absorb a lot of surplus labor. So I'm actually excited, as somebody who's always characterized as being a pessimist. This is a book with a happy ending. And you know, I'm not going to divulge the entire ending, or you won't read it. But the next Asia really does, I think, speak of a better balance to the region and a much more sustainable growth model. The blueprint for my thinking in writing much of the material for the book and in putting it together and organizing it actually came from some comments delivered by Premier Wen Jiabao a little over 2.5 years ago at the end of the National People's Congress in Beijing in March of 2007, where he stated amazingly to many people who watched this press conference of his that while on the surface the Chinese economy looks strong in terms of GDP and employment growth, beneath the surface, he said over 2.5 years ago, he was increasingly worried about a Chinese economy that was unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and ultimately unsustainable. This is the premier of China. I was sitting right next to a very senior official in the Chinese leadership at the time that the premier said that, and that official was just aghast at the depth of the premier's concerns. This was not an expected comment. And it wasn't as if he slipped up and said the wrong thing. This is a concern that he has come back to time and again, and I heard him again in the middle of September at a conference in Dalian, when he could have come onto the stage, huge conference, and boasted of China's recovery and strength in the midst of an unprecedented crisis. And instead, he said, "I'm still worried. We're gratified in recovery. We're going to hit our growth target, but it's a fragile recovery, and it continues to reflect an economy that's increasingly unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and ultimately unsustainable." And I think the only way to really address these concerns, the 4 uns, as we ended up calling them, is through the transition from the export to the consumption model that is at the heart of the next Asia. And the Chinese government is telling you that this has got to happen, and they're telling you it is going to happen. They're not telling you when, and I'm guessing it's going to be sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for getting us off to a good start. We have three distinguished panel members. I'm going to work across the table from my right to my left. Nick Lardy.
Thank you, Stape. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this event. I've been an admirer of Steve's writings for quite a number of years and have communicated with him and seen him frequently, so it's a special privilege for me to be here and talk about this new book. I think, if I can put it in a nutshell, I think the key insight of a lot of what Steve has written over the years, he didn't use this word, but I will, is that balance sheets matter. That the 5-year boom between 2003 and 2007 was an extraordinary period, as he just mentioned, a period in which it was based on asset growth based on assets rather than on income, particularly in the United States. And with this perspective, I think Steve was among those who argued early and most persistently that the outsized contribution of consumption to our growth in the United States and in turn to global growth was unsustainable, since it was based on increasing levels of household debt relative to disposable income rather than on rising real incomes. Similarly, he's drawn attention to the extraordinary low levels of consumption and high levels of savings and investment in China, kind of the mirror image, which also has elements of being unsustainable. I think this balance sheet perspective suggests that recovery from the bursting of the bubbles that we've witnessed over the last year or so will be accompanying, again, he didn't use this word, but it's in the book, it will be accompanied by massive deleveraging by financial institutions, by households, and eventually governments in the countries that follow this very asset-based growth pattern. And the corollary, of course, is that we may be in the early stages of global economic recovery, but I think his framework leads to the view that this is likely to be subpar for a number of years as this deleveraging process fades out. So I think the main conclusion, as Steve indicated at the end of his remarks, is there can't be a next Asia, and by implication, and also thoroughly discussed in the book, there can't be the next stage of globalization until we resolve some of these major savings investment imbalances, particularly in the United States and Asia. So I like the framework, and I do think it brings a perspective that most people ignore and have ignored at their peril. Steve's writing, I'm going to talk primarily about China's imbalances. The longest chapter in the book is on the imbalances in China. I agree with almost everything Steve has written. I think it's been extremely insightful. But I'm going to pick a couple of areas where I have a slightly different perspective. I can't stand up here and praise him for my full 10 minutes. But so this is a nuance. Steve correctly characterizes the Chinese economy as a complex blend of plan and market. But I would argue here that I think he underestimates the importance of the market and overestimates the importance of the residual planning agencies, notably the NDRC, and officials that work there and at higher levels. And I want to focus in my initial remarks on the services sector, which Steve talked quite a bit about. It's a key element in the transition to more consumption-driven growth, and as he indicated, it's surprising that China's services sector is relatively small share of GDP, only about 40%. Now, in the book, Steve praises the 11th five-year plan, the one we're near the end of now, because of the focus that it has on services sector, and he quotes very favorably also Ma Kai, who was the head of the NDRC at the time, in a speech that he gave early in the five-year plan about the determination to build up the services sector. Now, when I ask, what has actually happened? Well, what has happened is that the services share of GDP last year in 2008 is less than it was in 2004 when the five-year plan, the 11th five-year plan, was being drafted. And through the first 3 quarters of this year, the services sector is growing by less than the growth of GDP, which means that the share of the services sector is continuing to shrink. Now, I think this is a pretty remarkable development, because if you look at the first 2 decades of China's economic growth in the reform era, the share of services in its total output doubled. It was about 20% at the beginning of the process, and by 2002, it had reached 41.5%, which turns out to have been the peak. We've been going down since. Now, the question obviously is why? why, despite the fact that this was recognized as an important area to focus on, why did this happen? And here is where I'm going to explain, I think, Steve doesn't emphasize enough or underestimates the role of the market and prices in determining this outcome. First of all, after 2002, the RMB exchange rate was increasingly undervalued. What does an undervalued currency do in the domestic market? It means if you're exporting, you make more money. You convert your dollars back into RMB, and you get more RMB for every dollar you sell. If you're competing with imports, the price of imports goes up when your currency is undervalued, so you make more profits. You have more room to raise your price. So basically what happens is an undervalued currency increases profitability in what we call the tradable goods sector, which for China is overwhelmingly manufacturing. Well, where do these profits come from? Well, they come at the expense of other sectors of the economy. The undervalued exchange rate reduces profits in services. So what happened in China after 2002 is that profitability in the manufacturing sector doubled. It went from under 6% of GDP in 2002 to over 12% of GDP by 2007. Obviously, with profits rising, this is a market economy. Investment flowed increasingly into the manufacturing sector, and investment going into the services sector fell as a share of the total. So what happened is the 2-decade-long period in which we had relatively rapid growth of services was replaced now by almost a decade in which the service sector share of GDP has stagnated. Doesn't mean it hasn't grown rapidly. In absolute terms, of course, it has grown, but it hasn't grown as rapidly as the underlying economy, so its share has gone down. And as Steve points out, this is very important because the services sector is very labor-intensive, and if you're wanting to answer the question, why is consumption such a low share of GDP in China, it isn't really so much that household savings has gone up dramatically. It's that household disposable income has gone down. Well, if profits rise as a share of GDP, then compensation or wages has to be going down. And that's what's happened in China. And in part it is because the capital-intensive sector has been preferred by the exchange rate policy of the regime. So the growth of employment is lower. The growth of modern sector employment is lower than it otherwise would be. And the growth of wages then is also lower. So if you look at the decline in consumption, at least according to some Chinese data, about 80% of it is due to the fact that disposable income as a share of GDP is going down. Only about 20% of it is due to the fact that savings as a share of GDP has gone up. So kind of a corollary of this is I think Steve puts a little bit too much emphasis on the household sector rather than some of these other variables. Now, the contribution of undervaluation of the currency to the lagging growth of the services sector was reinforced by other central government policies, notably the underpricing of various factor inputs. And the best example is refined petroleum products. Under the Zhurongji era, in the end of the Zhurongji era, near the end, the domestic price of crude was raised, and they adopted what I call full cost price pass-through. In other words, when the price of crude went up, you had to increase the price of refined products, that is gasoline and diesel fuel. Well, when prices started to go up rapidly in the global market in 2003 and 2004, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, they fell off the wagon. They weren't willing to raise the domestic prices to the amount that it would be required. By 2007, early 2008, China had the lowest price of gasoline and diesel fuel of any emerging market economy that was not an oil exporter. Price of gasoline was actually even much cheaper than it was in the United States. So they had to have massive subsidies to the refiners, and of course that was also indirectly a subsidy of manufacturing. Fuels account for about 2/5 of all consumption of gasoline and diesel in China. It's very different from the United States. It's much, much more than is consumed, for example, in transportation. China also increasingly underpriced electric power. There are massive subsidies going to the generators and the distributors. And again, these factors are used much more intensively in manufacturing than in services, for example. 75% of all electric power in China is used in manufacturing, only about 11% by households, and only 10% for the entire service sector. So I would say, in short, the prices of foreign exchange, fuels, and the other factors of production that are directly controlled by the government have had a critical role in influencing the distribution of profits across various sectors of the economy, and thus have played a critical role in the determination of the allocation of capital, which in my view in China is overwhelmingly determined by profit-oriented firms. So the 11th five-year plan may have given a lot of lip service to the services sector. Ma Kai may have spoken glowingly about its importance. The State Council actually put out 2 major decrees emphasizing the importance of the services sector to sustaining China's growth. But all these plans and admonitions coming from Beijing were overwhelmed, in my opinion, by the price distortions that became increasingly important in this economy during this decade. So you can talk about the services sector, but if you don't have the key prices, at least something in conjunction with supply and demand, you're going to get an outcome that's unfavorable to your announced goal. Now, there's one more thing I'd like to talk about where I have a slight difference from Steve, and that is the nature of China's current kind of counter-cyclical policy, their stimulus program, if you will. Steve argues 3 things, and I think he said 1 or 2 of these. First of all, the investment and export-led policy focus today is and part of its stimulus program is strikingly reminiscent of its earlier counter-cyclical policies. He argues that China is betting on an upturn in global trade to secure its domestic economic recovery, and that he even says this in the book, I think, that China's leadership is either unwilling or unable to embrace a new and more balanced growth model. Now, I certainly think there are elements in these assertions that I agree with, but I think it gives inadequate recognition to several components of Chinese policy that have emerged over the last year or so. Everybody focuses on the massive stimulus program, the 4 trillion RMB, but this is only part of the stimulus program. This is the investment side of the program. There is also a massive increase in transfer payments, a massive increase in expenditures on just the things that Steve was talking about, health, education, and pensions as well. So there are substantial pro-consumption components of the policies that have emerged. Pension payments, for example, at the beginning of 2008, the beginning of 2009, and at the beginning of next year are being increased by 10% in each year. Now, if you look at what inflation has been, in the previous years, inflation's been relatively low. If pensioners get a 10% increase on January 1st, they should be very happy. Recipients of Social Security in the United States are going to get no increase whatsoever because there hasn't been much inflation over the last year. And China is exactly the same. China has a negative consumer price index year to date and probably will have a slight decline in consumer prices year over year. Transfers to rural residents are rising very sharply. In the first 3 quarters of this year, they increased by more than 26%, which has contributed to a substantial growth of rural household income. They also did reform fuels pricing in January of 2009, which partially addresses the criticism that I was raising earlier. Hopefully, this will be followed by reforms of pricing of natural gas, water, and electricity. And we do see some signs of rebalancing. I wouldn't want to make too much of it, but household consumption is actually growing relatively robustly in the current year. It's contributing about as much to GDP growth as it did in earlier years, which is quite surprising because we've seen a loss of employment, particularly in the first quarter, lower wage growth, and so forth. So to keep consumption contribution at roughly 4 percentage points of GDP in the current environment, I think is quite strong. And another very important indicator, of course, is that China's external surplus is declining dramatically. In the quarter that just ended, China's trade surplus was less than half of what it was a year earlier. So their current account is going to come down to something around 5.5%, which is exactly half of what it was 2 years ago. So I think the problem should be reformulated a little bit, and that is the question should be posed, how does China build on and consolidate the kind of modest rebalancing that has emerged in 2009? I think this makes the challenge that China faces seem a bit more manageable. They're not starting from square one on this. They've been working on some of these things for quite a while. For example, in the area of health care, the government's expenditures in health care in 2008 were twice what they were in 2006. Now, maybe as a low base, but now we're getting up to a significant amount of expenditure. I don't know of a government that has doubled their health care expenditures in 2 years. And in the first 8 months of this year, compared to the first 8 months of last year, health care outlays by the central government are up 45%. So I think they're moving ahead, at least in some domains, fairly aggressively. Unfortunately, the exchange rate area is not one of them. The currency is now depreciated quite a bit over the last half year. They've lost about one-third of the appreciation that had occurred cumulatively from the middle of 2005. So it's still a very mixed picture. More aggressive policies in some areas with slippage in the other areas. So I don't want to say that I'm ultimately any more optimistic than Steve about the pace at which this transformation can occur towards more consumption-driven growth. But I do think in some areas they've made very substantial progress over the last couple of years, which is now beginning at least to be reflected in some of the indicators. So I'm like Steve. I think I am optimistic about China, and in part because I do think it's a market economy, and I think they're working strongly on the rebalancing agenda, and I hope we'll see an acceleration of that trend as Steve forecasts. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Stanley, and again, a general reminder to our two other panelists, please try to hold your remarks to 2 minutes or less.
I'll speak from here. I was asked by Stape to try to focus on some of the bigger strategic aspects or implications of the book rather than to try to pretend I'm an economist, which those of you who know me know I'm not. So I thought an interesting place to start would be with the very concept of a China-centric Asia. I must confess that I initially bristled when I read this phrase, which Steve uses many times throughout the book. You know, as a former policymaker for the U.S. government, the very notion of a China-centric Asia seems, I'd have to say, inaccurate, if not threatening. But then while I was preparing a whole series of arguments to explain why I felt this way, I realized that in the context in which he's using the phrase, he's absolutely right. That, you know, from the economic point he's trying to make, I think it's persuasive that China is the leading trading partner of virtually every major economy in East Asia. I'm using the phrase East Asia to leave out India, where that would not quite be true. And that has major implications, and I think Steve does a great job of laying out in the book to show just how this trade is linked. Most of Asia supplying China inputs, which then go into supplying exports to the United States, and so you have a very clear supplier links. Once you recognize this, it's clear that the decoupling argument was always destined to be wrong. The interesting thing about it is, while this is easy to say in hindsight, Steve's out there in print 4 years ago saying this, and we wouldn't have had the debate if everybody had listened to him. So I think this was I'm okay with the concept of a China-centric Asia with this definition. I don't think we should broaden it to be, looking at it in terms of military factors or, typical geopolitical considerations, although there are influences. Second, the China-centric Asia that Steve presents is not 10 feet tall. And I found the book to be kind of a refreshingly sophisticated analysis. It's not in that camp that China's going to collapse. It's not in that camp that China's going to rule. It's openly in the camp of wanting China to succeed, a place where I'd like to put myself. It's worried that change won't occur fast enough, not that change is destabilizing. And it deals with the interesting problem that's been hinted at but not answered, and I don't have the answer. I'm hoping someone on the panel or the audience will, which is if the Chinese understand the problem, if they get the 4 uns, as you label it, then why haven't they done a better job? They've moved so aggressively on so many of the other goals they've set for themselves. Why can't they do it? Where does this facet of your pessimism come from? I think you laid out a good case about not only the need for China, but for the whole new Asia to undergo what you call the critical transformation, to usher in more of a pro-consumption, lighter and greener Asian economy. And I think, clearly that would have implications for the United States and the entire world if that were to happen, positive implications, some of which you've touched on, in your presentation itself, but clearly a world in which it would be easier to deal with some of the global problems because the global problems would be reduced, at least as far as the Asia component of it were concerned. My question is, you've used the phrase several times in your presentation, the wake-up call. And I guess I would ask, has there been one? That despite the quote several times about the 4 uns, my sense is that there's an awful lot of belief in China that they've been successful, that their model's better, that they've done better responding to the global crisis than anybody else. 8+% growth this year, over 9 next year. And is really the need for change on their side, or is the need for change in the U.S., which they're increasingly asking for in very clear terms? So I hope you get a chance to address that. Third point, I think the existence of a China-centric Asia has very important implications for American trade policy towards China. you've emphasized in that book. It didn't emerge in your presentation here just because of the limits of time, but I think for the audience, a critical point that if you accept that there's a China-centric Asia, any broad brush approach that tries to penalize China on the trade side, a wave of protectionism to restrict imports, would necessarily hurt most of the rest of Asia. You can't just get at China with a hatchet approach, and that there are unaware, you have to be aware of unintended consequences. And I think Steve rightly points out that some of the sharper tools need to be used if it's specific IPR cases or other grievances, rather than any kind of broad brush approach that would simply seek to restrict Chinese exports to the United States. Now, I found it fascinating that Steve, unlike most authors, is willing to do something that few do, which is admit that he was wrong. And this is at the end of the book when he says that his dire predictions about the Congress enacting protectionist legislation in 2006, 7, and 8, didn't happen. And of course, that's factually true. We know that. But he does make the point, and I think he's right to make the point, that none of us should sleep easy as we go into 2010, given the state of the economy, given the midterm elections, given some of the trade disputes pending, that we're not necessarily over the hump, even though one would hope that the passionate but also articulate case he makes why a protectionist policy would prevail. And I was pleased to see that you have testified multiple times in the Congress to share that point of view. Fourth point, the U.S. shouldn't try to stop the rise of the new Asia. I think that's a very important point. And interestingly, you say if the U.S. tried to do this, and you didn't answer or address the question, could it? But if the U.S. tried to, that Asia might integrate without the U.S. in it. And the risk of that, of course, is that you would have a divide down the Asia-Pacific region, a disruption to the global trading system that we haven't seen in recent era, and the consequences could be dire. So I think you were right to identify that risk. But then I was a little puzzled because you turn around the later point in the book, and having identified the risk, you seem to almost promote it. And what I'm referring to, and I hope you'll clear this up because I'm sure I'm misinterpreting it, but you talk about that the new Asia should focus on the benefits of cross-border linkages. And you specifically say that you see the potential for closer ties between Japan and China, the natural complementarity, as you refer to it. And, my question is, again, not could this happen? I think many of us could make cases about all the obstacles to this, and does China really want to do this? Is this the way they see the role of Japan, and do they want it? But I don't think that's the interesting question for today. I think the interesting question is, what if it happened? If it did happen, what if the new Asia did exactly what you prescribed? What if it moved on the, in terms of consumer economies? What if these Japan-China links happen? You've laid out some of the benefits, on the economic side, but what would it mean in a broader sense? Would this new Asia then be able to do what it couldn't do before, to decouple itself from the United States, if you have these more sensible economies? Would this be a good thing for U.S. interests? Would it leave China in a much more dominant situation in Asia if this situation were indeed to result? So I'm wondering, is this a case of beware what you ask for? Let me stop at that point.
Thank you, Stanley.
Bert? See if I can get this on the screen.
Are we blocking the audience from seeing this by sitting here, or?
Good job, boy. Thank you, Ambassador Roy, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I have to say at the outset that Stephen Roach is a hero of mine, and the book has told me in reading it that some of the thinking behind his heroism in the past, and in finishing it tells me that he can again be a hero in the future. I think that between the heroism of the past and the heroism of the future, however, there are a few things that I might like to raise. By the way, have any of you got an email recently, just in the last couple of days, about a spider that's underneath the seat in certain restrooms. Apparently came in on an Indian airplane and it has killed a number of women in Florida. Well, I got this email, and I went to the CDC website, and nothing there. And I went to the NIH website. There was nothing there. But my search engine had another entry down below that was the spider on the toilet seat hoax. So I looked it up, and it's an old story. But it goes back 5 years to the initial one in which everything about the story was wrong. There was no such spider, no such hospital, no such airline, no such national aeronautical civilian institutions that arrested everybody. And yet it spread like wildfire. And they interviewed the guy that wrote it, and he said, I just wanted to see how much people will read and pass on to their loved ones something that they have never stopped to check. Now, that's not the case here today. There are some very complex issues, but I just want to emphasize the strength and the value of a really good story. If you can get a really good story going, it's a lot of fun. Now, Stephen was my hero. It was about a year ago. I think I was writing on the savings glut. I'd been reading Bernanke's work, and things were coming about the cause of the crisis. And there was an article in the New Yorker about Ben Bernanke, big picture of Ben. I don't know if you get the New Yorker and you saw it, by John Cassidy. And as I was reading through this, the Bernanke thesis was, of course, that there was a savings glut in the world that began in the late 1990s that really was severely important for the conditions that created the crisis. And the savings glut was a causal factor that couldn't be ignored and had to really be put at the front of our understanding of the crisis. And that speech that he gave in 2005 broached this thesis, and then it's appeared since. It stopped appearing for a while, but then it showed up again just earlier this year. So it's still alive. And there was a quote of Stephen Roach saying, in retrospect, we didn't have a global savings glut. We had an American consumption glut. And I thought, just like my 6-year-old daughter, right on. I mean, that's exactly what it was, and he's been my hero ever since. Because the savings glut analysis is a good story. It's a really good story. It comes from the identity that if you have a big surplus, you're also going to have a lot of savings. The problem is that this identity in economics has no causal significance whatsoever. You have to get behind the savings and behind the spending to find out actually which came first or what the probabilities are of which came first. Because if Bill Gates walked into a store and decided he was going to buy all the inventory, that store would suddenly show very large savings. And you could say, well, you can see the savings caused this great sale burst, but you'd be wrong. The analogy there is that in the deregulation of the American financial sector and the non-regulation of the American sector in the 1999 banking law, the leverage that was allowed and permissible, and particularly after 2004, again, was so great that there was just a huge spending spree going on coming out of the United States that affected regions all over the world. And so that's why Stephen is my hero. He said in that Cassidy article, sort of, hold on, partner. We've got a buying glut and not a savings glut in the driver's seat here. And this is a picture that shows a bit what Stephen would have been talking about. I don't know, does this thing work? Yeah. Here is U.S. Consumer credit growth from 1980 on, and you can see that it surged during the S&L crisis, and here's the U.S. current account deficit. And then it began again when they started punching holes in the Glass-Steagall Act in the 1990s, and credit growth expanded, and it surged again when the U.S. Credit expanded during the dot-com boom. So did our current account deficit here get very strong. And then it really took off in 2002, 2003, 2004, and so did our current account deficit. That is, pointing that out verbally is what has made Stephen Roach a hero in my book. Now, this book is full of good insights, but it's also beautifully written. It's a pleasure to read. The style is light, but the subject is heavy, and so that's a great combination to be able to pull off, and I really congratulate Stephen for the way that he's communicated a lot of his ideas. And he points out that the crisis was caused by unsustainable credit-fed U.S. consumption spending, both at home on housing and globally on just about everything, generating this huge deficit that you see here. He said this huge deficit is one side of a serious global imbalance that we don't want to try to put back together again because it's basically an unhealthy imbalance. But he writes, we seem to be doing just that. And as he said, that's his major concern, that we seem to be, with the stimulus response, going back to recreating with credit expansion from the Fed and from everywhere else, an effort to try to boost consumption that will recreate the kind of imbalance that caused the crisis in the first place. So how do we get around this? How do we avoid repeating or recreating what has happened? And he gives some hints in the book at various places and at the end, and also at the end of various sections, about how that can be. I don't think he draws it out quite enough or nearly enough. And so that's his chance for heroism going forward, is to take some of the code words that he slips in at the end of some of his sections that are so lucid and elaborate on them. But let me get back to a good story, because one of the good stories, it was even too good for Stephen to resist. It has its roots in two parts of what he's been saying. The first is talking about Asia and China-centric Asia as if they are kind of a block moving together in this trade and commerce and financial world. When in fact I would maintain that the data and the empirical record shows that China is really a separate world from Japan, South Korea, province of Taiwan, from Singapore, Malaysia, even the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, that when you look at the pattern of Chinese trade, Chinese growth, compared to global demand, in particular U.S. export demand and U.S. GDP growth, China is out of sync. All of those other economies just play their role beautifully. When we sink, they sink. When we take off, they take off. Sometimes quarter lag, sometimes a half-year lag, but man, are they coupled? China's not. You look at its record, you think, boy, did someone make a mistake? Did their kids start drawing this diagram instead of some economist that says China is linked to the U.S. economy? Because it just doesn't work. Therefore, I would question severely that China is that well linked. And that brings me to the second issue, which is China's growth export-led? And here you take a little bit of a journey into the literature of export-led growth, which goes back decades in economic literature. And there's an important distinction made between healthy, balanced growth, in which trade is an important part, on the one hand, and export-led growth, on the other hand, in which you only grow when your exports surge. And then you're dependent on exports. But the literature makes it clear that if you're going to have a rapidly growing, healthy mix of domestic demand, consumption, investment, and so forth, trade has to be a part of it, and has to be an important part of it. And so China's pattern up until about 2005 fit that perfectly. Trade was important. It exported low technical skills, skill-requiring products, and then it imported technology. It took advantage of the imbalance in what it had and what the world had as a late comer in world modernization. And still, really, China's only a $4-something trillion economy when the U.S. is a $40+ trillion economy, so that it has a long way to go and a lot to borrow. And so I would question that fundamental assumption that China's growth is export-led. And if you say, well, what about the last 3 or 4 years? Then you get back to this U.S. demand. Oops, don't do that. Okay. You get to the point where if this spending is so great, why didn't we have inflation in the United States? Where did the inflation go? With that kind of buying power? Well, we imported a lot of products that kept the inflation pressure low, and you got them from China, but in a sense, we exported our inflation pressure to China. And so in 2004-05, and then again in 2007, China faced very serious inflation pressures and tightened the economy to try to fight inflation. And when it tightened in 2005, it cut back strongly on the import of machinery. And import growth slowed. Exports didn't accelerate. If anything, exports slowed as well. But imports slowed so much that a trade surplus opened up and continued. And when China looked like it was coupled and declined with the United States economy at the end of last year and earlier this year, it was really also reeling from its effort to try to control inflation with credit tightening that had gone on for too long. So there's a quote in, I guess it's page 79, and this is where I therefore want to ask Stephen about this, because it's clearly not a spider here. This is something quite complex with a lot of data involved, and so I want to hear Stephen's wisdom on this. But here he goes on page 79, talking about an insidious, that's a good word, an insidious aspect of the global imbalances. China led the way by recycling a disproportionate share of their massive foreign exchange reserves back to dollar-based assets. That kept China's currency highly competitive, as any export-led economy likes, but also prevented U.S. interest rates from rising, thereby keeping the magic alive for bubble-dependent U.S. consumers. In effect, the world's bubbles fed off each other. And that's just fantastic prose. I mean, that just reads so beautifully. But have you heard that story before? It's a good story, and because you don't get any help at CDC or NIH for that kind of topic, but let's consider this idea of recycling surpluses. What do I do? Oh, here we go. First place, when was the crisis? This is one way to look about when the crisis was. This is the price of housing, the rate of change in housing growth. And it peaked in 2005. By mid-2006, housing prices were no longer climbing like crazy. This is also the year in which subprime defaults, not subprime lending, but subprime defaults actually peaked. So that's one proxy for the crisis timing, if you will. And it goes right along with the U.S., the growth in the U.S. current account deficit. The money that was also going into the housing market was also spilling abroad, buying all kinds of goods and services all around the world. And by the way, the literature in the Review of International Finance on some of the causes of the current account deficit in the United States stressed that because these surpluses show up so many parts of the world, you can't blame it on any one region of the world. You have to come back to the United States and say that's where this deficit began. Now, I have looked at current account surpluses and deficits, and there are three regions that had quite large surpluses that actually track very well with the U.S. deficit. One is in Northern Europe. There's a group of countries centered on Germany and the Netherlands, but also with Switzerland and Sweden and Denmark, that if you just add them up, you get whopping current account surpluses that match the U.S. deficit. And you also get non-China, non-mainland China, Asia, with whopping surpluses. And finally, you get oil exporters around the world, which is no surprise. So that if you want to look at a good chunk of the global surpluses that correlate with the U.S. deficit, you need to look no farther than Northern Europe, non-mainland China, Asia, and oil exporters. There are other regions of the world that have deficits, like the periphery of Europe and Latin America, so this looks pretty tall compared to that. But where's China in here? There's China. China comes to the party late. Here we are. We've got the crisis just building like gangbusters. China has really, as a share of U.S. GDP, which is what all of these are, very modest, to put it sort of even extravagantly, share in the global surpluses that seem to be spewing out from what's happening in the U.S. deficit. So the question that I have is, why the emphasis on China's recycling when you have surpluses all over the world that are correlated with the U.S. deficit? It's a great story. I can see why I might be fooled by it, but I need to know why this is the case, and I'm sure Stephen will give me some help in that. So that's where I'm interested in a little bit of discussion, and I think the idea of global imbalances. There's some other ideas I've talked about, the imbalance in the notion of the savings glut. there's also an imbalance in thinking about what a balanced world economy would look like. And it goes back to economic theory that said rich countries should run surpluses and lend their money to poor countries. And that looks great from the rich country perspective. But the G20 decided in 2005 that, in fact, it really ought to be the other way around, that since the rich countries print the reserve currencies of the world, it makes sense for them to also run surpluses, for the developed world to sell products and run surpluses while the rich countries run deficits and the poor countries run surpluses. They also get to accumulate some foreign exchange. They also don't have to lose asset ownership of all of their property so quickly. So a great deal of the logic of how far China's currency has to be revalued that is proposed in various scholarly journals here in Washington rests in part on the foundation that you've got to have an exchange rate that will get China into a large deficit position, when in fact that may not be the desired direction at all, certainly from China's point of view. All right, I think I've run out of where I need to go. I think we'll continue this in the discussion. I apologize for overrunning my time.
Stephen, you've been paid the ultimate compliment, I think, by all of the commentators by demonstrating clearly that your book is stimulating. And I must say, certainly my own impression as I read through the book was it was stunning how long in advance you pointed out things that were going to happen, and then they happened at a time when most people weren't pointing out those things. So if you're a pessimist, I would say that certainly at the moment a certain amount of pessimism is warranted, and you've been vindicated. However, there were some interesting questions raised, and before we go to the audience, would you like an opportunity to address any of these questions that have been brought out?
Yes, I will be brief because it's really important to get all of you involved. And let me just start in reverse order with Bert. I mean, I can't tell you how gratified and thrilled I am to be to walk out of here tonight and know that I'm one of Bert's heroes. I mean, that was worth the long nights and weekends of writing the book. And I appreciate it. And your spider story is a good one. But, you know, the real story, Bert, is that there weren't spiders in the Indian Plains. Turns out there were rats. Have you heard that one?
Oh, no. That's a good story, too. Yeah.
No, it's a true story, actually. Air India, recently, they had a labor dispute between the pilots and the flight attendants, and they actually had fisticuffs on outside of one of the planes, and they had, went into a work stoppage, and then there was a slowdown in the maintenance department because they found rats crawling around in the baggage compartment of one of the planes, and they were afraid that the rats, if they didn't get them out, would eat the wiring and the plane would crash. So, I mean, you know, there are stories, Bert, that you have to realize actually end up being true. Anyway, I think, you know, the point that you make at the end on, you know, this surplus savings glut and, you know, the role that China may have played in creating these imbalances, I think your point is certainly well. It's a good point, and one that I definitely concede. I think when you look at an unbalanced world that was delighted to go along for the ride on the back of unsustainable and excess U.S. consumption, you know, why pin the blame on one export-led economy? And you're correct in saying that there are plenty of countries in the world, from Japan to Germany to basically all of East Asia, to you could throw in the resource economies of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, you know, America's outsourcing platform in Mexico. I mean, the world has a lot at stake in being supported by excess U.S. consumption. And I certainly don't want to, in the least bit, lay any disproportionate part of the blame on China, but just to point out that, and this gets to Stanley's point, why, if the premier knew that China and articulated the view that China was unsustainable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and ultimately unsustainable, why didn't they do anything about it? And I ask myself that question a lot. And it's a terrific and very important question. And the reason, I think, is because China and these other surplus nations, they were seduced by the same artificial boom as we were. It was really convenient for all of us to in the world to go along for the ride, to believe in, and here's where Bert's got it right, the spider story. I mean, this was a story that just became contagious around the world, that we could create artificial growth by levering asset bubbles in America, drive our consumption ratio up to levels that no country had ever done, and then draw our income-based savings rate down, to levels that no country had ever done, leading country had ever done in the history of the world, import surplus savings from abroad to keep growing, and run massive current account and trade deficits to attract the capital. And we thought this was a sustainable model. I mean, that was just ludicrous. There was nothing sustainable about that in the United States, and there's nothing sustainable about it in the surplus saving export-led economies in the world, including China. But I don't want to just single out China. And this is the big risk of these global imbalances, that we create artificial demand through reckless and irresponsible policies, and then it becomes a really easy thing for other nations to actually become free riders on, and in sort of sell us things that we can't afford. So I think China was seduced by that, an increasingly China-centric Asia was seduced by that, and I guess I do have, a different point of view than Bert does about the role that China plays in shaping the intra-regional trade flows. But we'll iron that one out. Alone, the two of us, mano a mano, in a bar. But I think these imbalances. You've all said it; they do cut both ways, and it's important to look at them in that context. Nick raises some just very profound questions, and I think at the heart of Nick's critique is a different perception about, and he said it very clearly, China as more of a market-based economy than I think is the case. And so by maintaining and developing that point of view in Nick's market-based perceptions of China, by definition, market-based mechanisms of equilibrium, especially the exchange rate, play a more central role in his model of China than they do in mine, which is more of a state-directed system where the currency is more of an outgrowth of the regime than a central piece driving the regime. And I think Nick's points are well taken, and they always make me think long and hard about my own perceptions of China and its role in the world economy. And I'm not here to tell you that I don't think that Nick's points are not well taken. But I do think that for an unbalanced system like China, to force the adjustment mechanism through the currency is probably not the right thing to do now. I think it would be a little bit like pushing on a string. For a society that saves to excess because of enormous turnover in its labor market due to state-owned enterprise reform, due to the lack of a safety net, I think the currency is not going to really alter the propensity to save or spend. I think you've got to do more in the way of changing the structural underpinnings of the society before you can then expect the currency to play a more active role. So, I mean, I agree with the mechanism that Nick lays out. I just think it's too early to expect that from the currency. And this is an important and central issue of debate in looking at Chinese imbalances. And I think, his points are strong and powerful. I think the jury is out, and I don't think this one is resolved. There's a lot of other rich comments that were made, but I don't, I just want to at least pick on one strand of each of these discussants whose views I really appreciate.
Okay. The floor is open. Yes? The microphone's coming.
And by the way, I want to urge you all to address most of your questions to the other three discussants.
Well, I will do my best then. Thank you very much for this wonderful speeches. My name is Xiong Ming. I'm a Chinese reporter with the 21st Century Business Herald. I have a trade question. It goes to Mr. Roach and Mr. Roth. As Obama is going to China in 2 weeks, I have the sense that even though trade policy is one of the things that the Chinese wants to hear most from the Americans, that President Obama is reluctant to lay out his trade policy. And I wonder, what do you think the reason is behind this? And also, looking into 2010, do you think the trade protectionism will be strengthened, considering this U.S. economic recovery that comes without employment rising, and also a midterm election in the Congress? And this is my question. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just be brief, and then all of you can join in. I think the president is reluctant to really focus or deflect attention away from the trade issue for one obvious reason: that America's unemployment rate at 9.8%, is unbelievably high, and the risk is that it goes higher, and an outgrowth of that is just a growing sense of unease and disenfranchisement by the constituencies that supported him in this election. And I think looking to 2010, especially today, a day after the sort of off-cycle elections, when the Republicans did better than the Democrats, I think he's even more uneasy about the political support that he has in a period of extremely high unemployment. And I would just, say one final thing. In the 3-year period, 2005 to 2007, by our calculations, 45 separate pieces of anti-China trade legislation were introduced in the U.S. Congress. 45. Not one of them passed. Why? The unemployment rate averaged 4.7% over that 3-year period. So now we're more than double that. And my concern in looking to 2010 is that if another one of these bipartisan bills passes, there's a good chance that President Obama might allow that to become law, and that would be a horrible and very disturbing development for not just U.S.-China trade relationships, but for trade liberalization on a global scale. And I think it's a huge mistake. We've said it before. I've testified against it. The congressmen, they don't listen. This is not anything new. But what is new is the much higher degree of pressure on American workers and the pressure that in turn workers put on their elected representatives. And I think it's a big risk in 2010.
Stanley, you want to add anything?
Well, on the first part of your question, I think the Obama administration has to speak for the Obama administration. Talking, though, about the political environment in 2010, I think the complexity of it is that while there is a sense that with the unemployment rate this high, something needs to be done, I think there's more understanding than in some previous years that there are consequences for taking actions. I think that the Congress is very aware of the enormous holdings that China has in U.S. treasuries and which is continuing to add to, and that China is not without recourse. I think there's growing awareness that the possibility of a trade war, that China has ability to retaliate as well. So I think the calculus is more complex than just the unemployment rate, and rather it's, will this actually help? So there's a political need, but there's also the need to do something that won't make things worse. And so far, we've avoided actions where in many cases the political calculation looked inevitable that one of these bills would pass and hasn't.
Yes, in the back.
Thank you very much, everyone. My name is Jeff Meyer. I'm a graduate student at Johns Hopkins. Just a question for Dr. Roach and anyone else that's interested. Just wondering, recently, what factors Chinese policymakers have been considering when thinking about adjusting the value of their currency or the type of currency regime they have, what factors they're considering, they have been considering the past few years, currently, and looking ahead the next few years. Thanks.
Well, I think Nick should answer that.
Well, I would begin by kind of questioning the premise of your statement. I don't think there's a uniform view on this within China. I think there have been some arguing rather persistently for, if you were in charge of trying to control monetary growth when the injections into the domestic money supply as a result of the buying up of foreign exchange to keep the exchange rate undervalued were more than 10% of GDP for 5 consecutive years, you might have a different view than, if you were the first party secretary in Guangdong province. So I do think there's a tension between the coastal regions that have benefited very much from the very substantial growth of exports that we've seen, and those that have other responsibilities or other agendas. And I think that's the way it played out. I think the reason they pegged back to the dollar a little more than a year ago or 15 months ago was that the traders were getting the upper hand. They didn't want to have changes in the value of the currency between the time they signed a contract and the time they got paid months later. And so they went back to a peg. Now, to their credit, the Chinese allowed their currency to appreciate dramatically as the dollar appreciated. But the export interests, I think, are very short-term in their orientation. They don't want to lose money on transactions. They're not thinking ahead to what their market share might be in 2 or 3 years. So now they're going back down against the dollar, and as I mentioned earlier, have depreciated quite substantially since March of this year. So they seem to have reached a compromise. We're going to fix to the dollar. I don't know what will move them off that policy.
If I could
Nick,
just add, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask you a question. I agree with the facts as you stated them, but if you take as a scenario where the baseline case is a weaker dollar, therefore a dollar peg really leads to a broad depreciation of any currency that's pegged to the dollar, doesn't this really become even more inflammatory for the world maybe the non-U.S. world, but China's Asian neighbors and Europeans, to start pointing the finger more and more about the undervaluation of the currency, and the world starts to gang up on China for this currency policy.
Well, I think there is a risk. We saw it in Paul Krugman's column a couple of weeks ago, in which he attacked China for pursuing beggar thy neighbor policies as a result of the depreciation that's occurred over the last 6 or 7 months. But what he didn't point out is, as the dollar was skyrocketing back in the fall of 2008 and the winter or very early spring of 2009, their currency was appreciating dramatically. The dollar has depreciated a lot in the last 6 months, but they're back. We're back. The dollar's back roughly to where it was 15 months ago. So, as I say, they seem, since most of their trade is denominated in dollars, probably 70% or more. The short-term fix has been to peg nominally to the dollar and take whatever outcome you get on a broad, as you say, on a broader, more trade-weighted basis. It was rapid appreciation for 3 or 4 quarters, and now it's rapid depreciation.
I think there's some coherence to this that maybe isn't given enough credit. And Nick and I have talked about this privately recently, that if China's policy beginning in 2005 was to peg to a rough basket of currencies, and in fact that was catching up a bit with what was happening to the euro, which I would maintain was the real currency that was out of balance then with the world, and its trade surplus showed it, but that it moved with that basket. But it only moves with that basket as long as it means appreciating vis-a-vis the dollar. So that if you get a situation where the dollar begins to strengthen dramatically, if you're going to follow your basket rule, your rough rule, and we don't think it's such a strict rule, but it's roughly followed. If you're going to follow your basket rule when the dollar takes off and strengthens during the rush of the crisis this time last year and afterwards, that means you're going to devalue with respect to the U.S. dollar if you're going to stick with your basket. And that's a real no-no, I think, politically in the Chinese minds. They realize that would not read well in U.S. newspapers. So while the dollar was strengthening, they just stuck with the dollar and went up so that there were no headlines, China devalues the renminbi vis-a-vis the dollar. That didn't happen. But then when it started to come back down again towards where it would get back to its position vis-a-vis this basket, they also stuck with the dollar. And so now, as Nick rightly points out, they're back to about where they ought to be. I think if the dollar continues to weaken dramatically and the euro strengthens, we'll see an appreciation of the renminbi vis-a-vis the dollar. So that I see this coherence, but I'm a believer in all kinds of things. But it seems to me that that's a plausible explanation for what's happening.
What do you think the political implications...
Could you identify yourself,
I'm
please?
sorry. Howard Wiarda from here at the Wilson Center. What do you think the political implications of a more consumer-driven China might be? You suppose that a consumer-driven economy might also lead to a consumer demand-oriented political system, and can the leadership permit that?
Let me embellish on the question by quoting from your book, that I'm confident that China will eventually deliver on the consumption front, setting in motion yet another mega trend that has the potential to reshape the global landscape. So, I mean, this is potentially a very big issue. If they
Beats me. I don't know. Look, this is a great question. And consumer-led societies are ultimately societies that become increasingly aspirational, that involve freedom of choice, expression, increasingly free transfer of information, and a political system that accommodates that important transformation. And so this is the ultimate challenge for a one-party system is to make certain, and this is, I think, China studied very carefully the experience of the former Soviet Union and how the economic and political tensions that emerged in the Soviet Union society ultimately were unsustainable. And I think China gets it. They know that as the consumer society increasingly blossoms, that the controls and the political infrastructure that supports their society must evolve as well. And they would be foolish, and they are not foolish, to encourage a transformation that is at odds with their political and social values. But you're right in pointing to the question, and I think that the question itself is very informative in telling you what the answer has to be. And if the political system does not evolve or goes backward, then one of two things will happen. The consumer society itself will not grow, or there will be an enormous source of tension that emerges between these two.
If I could just add a quick point, I think that there's a misunderstanding that China's consumption share in GDP has declined in recent years, and some people think that China's consumption levels have declined. In fact, consumption in China has been growing very rapidly, household consumption. And it's a sort of a truism in economics that even if you have a 40% investment rate, that consumption then becomes a smaller share of GDP. If that investment is used well, and so the whole economy grows at 10 or 9%, consumption grows at 10 or 9% also. And if you reduced the share of consumption in GDP, you would get a one-time gain in consumption growth, and after that, consumption would grow more slowly. And Goldman Sachs has its most recent projections out that shows an enormous consuming China within 10 or 15 years. And so I would maintain that the emphasis on investment and consumption isn't necessarily an irrational sign of imbalance within the Chinese economy. The return to capital in China, and China doesn't have too many people, it has too little capital. The return to capital in China, which is so scarce, is extremely high, and both for social capital and for private capital. And so households and companies alike are responding to that very high rate of return on invested capital. And so I expect the share of capital in investment to stay quite high in GDP, and that this is actually something that the bulk of the population appreciates because it's going to keep their consumption growing very rapidly. But I would caution us not to mistake the descriptions of China's somewhat shrinking share of consumption in GDP for shrinking consumption. That is not happening. It's growing extremely fast.
And I would also caution you against drawing conclusions on the basis of anything that Goldman Sachs says.
There are two hands here. I can't differentiate. Why don't you each ask your question, and then we'll answer them.
Okay, thank you. Sheldon Garin from Princeton University, and I'm currently a fellow here at the center, and I'm writing a book on the global history of the promotion of savings, so I come at it from a somewhat different perspective. Very much enjoyed your talk, but it did strike me that much of your analysis is aspirational in the sense that these things haven't happened, and we just talked about projections, but again, we're not talking necessarily about China now being a consumer-led society. And I'm reminded that for the last 30 years or so, we have demanded that the Germans and the Japanese also radically expand their consumption and lower their saving. In the German case, that hasn't happened. In the Japanese case, the savings rate went down, but consumption has not risen. And I am sort of wondering on the basis of that whether we are going down the same road with our aspirations for what China should do rather than what necessarily would happen. And my question to you is, if that you were arguing against yourself, since you know the Chinese leadership well, could you think of arguments that they might put up that would actually resist the trend toward China being a very consumer-led society, and that might continue to privilege saving either to avoid state expenditures on welfare or to provide capital, low-cost capital, by promoting saving?
Could you?
Ivan Shpagowski from the Commerce Department. I was hoping that you could comment on the dollar carry trade and the ability to borrow the dollar at a low interest rate and currently depreciating, and especially as this applies to Asia outside of mainland China, and the degree to which this is fueling asset bubbles in Asian equity and real estate markets.
You want me to answer those?
They're easy questions.
Well, let me first deal with this sort of the lessons of Japan and Germany. These are issues that come up a lot inside of China, and they get framed in the way of why should we take your advice when look what's happened to you. And now, of course, they add the United States to the litany of the wrong advice that was given to Germany and Japan. I still think that in their heart of hearts, China does believe, as the Premier has stated repeatedly, that unbalanced growth is not sustainable and must be addressed. But I think the lessons that they're taking from Germany, Japan, and now the United States is that the real risk here is making mistakes on policy, macro policy, and regulation. And so they will, from time to time, slow down the pace of reform, especially in the financial area, because they're nervous about financial markets getting away from them and ultimately undermining the stability that is so important to sustainable growth in China. So I think they're studying not just the changes in these economies from a real economic perspective, but also the policy infrastructure that underpins them. And I think that they've come out with a view that there's less wrong with the imperatives of changing the structure, but the policies and the regulations and the tolerance for, quote, financial innovations, those are areas where I think they definitely want to go more slowly. This is a lesson they learned in the Asian financial crisis, and it's with them today. And dollar carry trade, fueling asset bubbles. There are people now that are making a big deal out of this. It's not. I mean, it's certainly clear in some parts of Asia, especially Hong Kong, where I'm living today, that small economies, small markets, when they're flooded with liquidity, you will definitely have unsustainable surges in asset prices. And in Hong Kong right now, the property market is really certainly in a bubble, and the Hong Kong Monetary Authority last week took explicit action, not through their broad monetary policies, but through some micro policies to try to dampen excess mortgage lending that's driving property prices back up sharply. But this underscores one of the biggest problems in the post-bubble world, and that is once you sort of get hooked on the drug of allowing bubbles to occur, when they burst, the next thing you got to do is you got to flood the system with liquidity, you create the next bubbles, and when they burst, you got to do it again, and each bubble gets bigger and bigger, and you're locked into a very destructive interplay between bubbles policy, liquidity, and distortions of asset-dependent economies. And it's really tough to break the habit. That's what this whole post-crisis period is all about. Is there anyone, is there a policymaker, is there a leader, is there a group of leaders who have the guts to do what someone like Paul Volcker did? Break the back of inflation by putting an economy through the ringer, or a group of economies through the ringer. And that's a big question, and it ultimately involves leadership and political strength and the willingness to really deal with what I think is a potentially very destructive chain of events.
But if I could just say, in your book, you you point to the answer by praising Obama's strategy in 3 dimensions: infrastructure, technology, alternative energy technology investment, and human capital. And I found that fascinating because those are not household consumption items. And so the issue then, it sounds like Hyman Minsky, who's an economist who actually described the thing you've just described of this ever bigger liquidity explosions, talking about the need for government that created jobs. And so you've got public consumption. I didn't mean to burn them, but your book had these seeds of heroism. And so I was wondering if you wouldn't let them grow.
There you go, you're heroes again. I mean, look, I wrote that stuff right after he was elected, and now we've sort of lived the dream for a while, and it's there'll be a second edition, Bert.
I think last question. Gene.
Eugene Martin with Asia Pacific Strategies Consulting Company. Let me maybe follow on this gentleman's question, sort of a political economic question, if I may, and that is, China, all these years since the beginning of the reforms, has said that they really want a peaceful international environment so they can develop their own country and so forth. I guess the question I have is, if they rebalance their economy, become more consumer-oriented and less dependent upon the export markets, is there a possibility that they may change their position and be less cooperative in terms of international peace and prosperity and so forth? In other words, become much more focused on their domestic needs rather than the export markets?
It's a great question. I am not an expert on sort of military strategy in China or anywhere else, and Stanley certainly is much better equipped to address an issue like that. But I honestly don't think that will be the case. I think that, again, China's military ambitions tend to be overblown in the West. You spend time, across the river, go to the Pentagon, talk to their strategy team, and they'll convince you that China has enormous military ambitions, and they'll assemble data to demonstrate that. I don't buy it. I think the biggest issue on the military front has been Taiwan, and that's been tempered a lot by the political changes in the Taiwanese government in the last few years, after 8 difficult years. I think an equally interesting question, though, is, let's just say that China does become more autonomous, and China-centric Asia becomes more independent from the West. How does the West feel then about losing its influence over this country and over this region? And I don't ask that question idly, because in discussions I've had with a number of leading foreign policy experts in the Obama administration, this is a question that they have asked of themselves and of me. So your question is important, and it cuts both ways. But Stanley, what do you think about this?
I don't see the logic chain that says as you move towards a consumer society that you're going to end up as being more militaristic. I think the kind of changes that take place as you move down that path, if anything, take you in the opposite direction and less likely to want to risk your gains from the things that could happen if you move on the militaristic direction. So I don't see the correlation there at all.
I would like to thank all of you and thank our panelists for, if you have developed an insatiable desire to read the book, I think there are copies available outside at a reasonable price. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Stan.